Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and today I want to talk about a scenario where a buyer's broker has shown property to more than one buyer and both buyers become interested in purchasing the property. First question, can a buyer's broker show property to more than one buyer, same piece of property to more than one buyer? And the answer is yes. The time at which one of those buyers says, I want to write an offer, is when the buyer broker is then prohibited from taking further action with the other buyer. So buyer broker, you've shown the same property to two buyers. One of them says, I'm ready to write an offer. Great. You sit down and you write that offer. When the other buyer wants to come back and write an offer, you are not prohibited. You are prohibited. You are not allowed to write the offer for the competing buyer. You have to refer that buyer, the second buyer, to another broker. It can be another broker in your firm, and you can collect a referral fee for making that referral to a buyer's agent to represent that second buyer. But you cannot write that competing offer. And the reason for all of this is that the agency law says that once a buyer writes an offer, that marks the beginning of a transaction, and a buyer's broker is prohibited from taking any action that is adverse or detrimental to a buyer's interest in a transaction. So even though the first buyer's offer isn't accepted yet, it technically triggers the definition of transaction, and buyer broker, you are prohibited from taking any action that would be adverse or detrimental to that first buyer's interest in that offer process. Writing a competing offer would certainly be adverse or detrimental to that first buyer who's trying to win the bid. If that first buyer, though, negotiates with the seller and is unable to reach agreement, and they signal clearly that they are done with that property, dealing with that seller, they're moving on, and then a second buyer comes along, as long as the first buyer is completely out of the picture and you can document that through your transaction folder, then you can write an offer for a new buyer. They wouldn't be at that point a competing buyer, they would be a new buyer because the first buyer is gone. There's no competition left between the two buyers. That's dealing with buyer brokers. Let's also talk about listing brokers. Listing broker, let's say a buyer comes along and wants to write an offer, and you are the one they ask to write the offer, and you write that offer for the buyer. You could, if you enter a buyer agency agreement with that buyer, and only if you enter a buyer agency agreement with that buyer, you could be a dual agent. And if you become a dual agent, then you, as the listing broker, could not write a competing offer for another buyer, even if you didn't represent that competing buyer, because that new buyer would be in competition with the buyer you represent. But listing broker, if you write an offer for a buyer as the seller's exclusive agent, meaning you are not a dual agent, you don't have a buyer agency agreement with the buyer, all you're doing is, as seller's agent, writing an offer for a buyer, then you could write as many offers for as many buyers as come to you with that request. Because you don't represent the buyer, you represent the seller exclusively, and you are not taking any action that's adverse or detrimental to the seller's interest in the transaction, and the seller is the only party you represent, so long as you have not signed a buyer agency agreement with any of the buyers who are writing offers. I hope that's clear. If it's not, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtor member.